Is a new coalition of the willing trying to take on Iran? Britain joins forces with the US to secure the Strait of Hormuz. But will it only antagonize Tehran? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the American-led task force in the Gulf. When the US pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, it triggered a series of events that had some asking, could Washington and Tehran really go to war? Europe was supposed to mediate and save the nuclear accord, but that reality seems further away each day. Tankers have been seized, sanctions reimposed, and the nuclear deal is hanging by a thread. If EU nations are still trying to calm things down, Britain seems to want no part of it. Just weeks into becoming Prime Minister, Boris Johnson has been accused of turning his back on his European allies by joining a US-led task force in the Gulf. The naval mission is to protect merchant ships from Iranian aggression. But France and Germany say it's only going to escalate tensions. Melinda Nusifora reports.
Britain's new Prime Minister says his country's policy on Iran hasn't changed. The United Kingdom remains committed to the 2015 nuclear deal and to a de-escalation of tensions in the Gulf. But one of Boris Johnson's first foreign policy moves was deploying 2 Royal Navy warships to the Strait of Hormuz on what the UK says is a security mission. Britain says it isn't an act of aggression, but Iran is interpreting it otherwise.
ما مسئول امنیت این منطقه هستیم. ما همیشه امنیت خلیج فارس رو، تنگه هرمز رو ما حفظ کردیم. امنیتی که باید برای همه باشه. نه امنیتی که به هزینه یک کشور یا کشور دیگری باشه.
A fifth of the world's oil travels through the Strait of Hormuz. And recently, the strategic passage has taken centre stage in a power struggle between Iran and the West. This week, the UK agreed to a request from the US to conduct a joint maritime security mission there.
The threat in the Straits of Hormuz is to all international shipping, and I spoke to Mike Pompeo immediately on appointment, and we've shared the view that we need to uphold the rules-based international order, and actually it would be a good idea to have a broad coalition supporting keeping the freedom of navigation in that region.
In June, the US blamed Iran for multiple attacks on ships in the Gulf, accusations which Tehran denies. Then, last month, British Royal Marines boarded an Iranian ship off of Gibraltar on suspicion of transporting oil to Syria in violation of international sanctions. 2 weeks later, it was Iran's turn. It seized a British tanker in the Strait, which it said had breached maritime law. The tit-for-tat moves have inflamed already strained diplomatic relations.
امنیت در برابر امنیت. تنگه در برابر تنگه. نمیشه تنگه هرمز برای شما آزاد، تنگه جبل الطارق برای ما ناآزاد. این نمیشه.
We're not going to barter a ship that was detained lawfully with a ship that was detained illegally. That's not the way Iran will come in from the cold.
Other countries, including Australia, France and Germany, have declined to sign up to the US mission, questioning what some call its maximum pressure approach. So, is Britain's new leader looking to forge his own foreign policy path? Or is this an attempt to keep the US on side as Brexit looms? Melinda Nusifora, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Lisbon is Ghonja Tazmini, the author of the book Revolution and Reform in Russia and Iran. She's also an associate member of the Center for Iranian Studies at SOAS University in London. Simon Mabon is a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Center and an international relations lecturer at Lancaster University. And in Washington, D.C. is law professor and former U.S. Marine Dave Jonas. He served as the Pentagon's nuclear non-proliferation planner under the Bush administration. Good to have you all on the program. Simon Mabon, let's start with you. Did the Europeans let down the UK, or has the UK let down the Europeans by deciding to go all in with the US when it comes to patrolling the Gulf?
I think it depends who asks the question. If it's the Europeans asking the question about why the British joined the US and went all in, as you say, then they certainly feel let down. But then if the British are saying, well, why didn't you put up a stronger fight to keep the nuclear deal alive, then they have every right to feel let down. I think in reality we're seeing that this has been a failure of politics and a failure of diplomacy to get the deal saved for those who wanted to save it, and for a coalition to be built to actually address the Iranian crisis in a responsible way. Instead, we see the emergence of two contrasting camps that have got deep-seated grievances against each other.
Dave Jonas, is this a massive win for the Trump administration? When the Germans and others are hesitant and they still have faith in the nuclear deal and they don't want to be seen as taking sides, that the UK makes such a strong pivot towards the US position? Is it a win?
It's hard to categorize either as a win or a lose, but I do get kind of amused when people talk about how this agreement is something that is sort of like the Rock of Gibraltar. Like, how could it possibly have been disrupted when all it really is or was a handshake? It's not a treaty in any legal sense of the word. And so when a new administration comes in, like the Trump administration, it should surprise no one that the policy changes and the U.S. pulled out. After all, President Trump ran on the promise of saying that the deal was the worst deal ever and that he would pull us out of it. He's done just that. Now, whether the UK chooses to pull out based on what happens and what has been happening is something we're going to have to wait to see. If I had to make a prediction, I believe that they will.
Right. Khonja Tasmini, so we've seen this tit-for-tat action taking place in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Gulf. Does it make a big difference to the Iranians when they see the United Kingdom joining the Americans in patrolling the strait?
I don't think it makes a big difference. After all, the UK and Iran have been engaged in this tit-for-tat with the Grace 1 and then the Stena Impero. So it's not like it's out of the blue. If you contextualize it, this is a geopolitical dispute, and another layer to it, as we've seen, is not surprising.
Right. And when Dominic Raab says our approach to Iran hasn't changed, we remain committed to working with Iran and our international partners to de-escalate the situation and maintain the nuclear deal. So he's saying that and still patrolling with the US in the Strait of Hormuz. Does that encourage you that the UK can kind of play both sides in a way?
I don't think the UK is playing both sides. I think it's simply making a statement about upholding the principles of freedom of navigation. I think that this isn't any form of military alignment. This is no coalition of the willing, even though it might seem that way, or even though that is the message that perhaps the US wants to get across to Iran.
Yeah, as we try to understand, Simon, British intentions here, is it something as simple as the UK wants to get a good bilateral trade deal after Brexit under Boris Johnson, so geopolitically, in terms of foreign policy, it's going to do whatever it can to play nice with Trump?
I think there's probably a range of factors going into British calculations right now, and Brexit obviously is front and centre. I think that's one of the reasons why there's been this fractious relationship with Europe and why there's been a bit of a schism over the European stance towards the nuclear deal. Although I should add that Britain worked incredibly hard to get the deal off the ground and worked incredibly hard to make the deal happen. So there seems to be a slight dissonance there, I think. But there's little doubt that Boris Johnson and his team are obviously very concerned about what will happen if and when the UK leaves the European Union. And it's working incredibly hard to get these bilateral trade deals with the United States, with China, with India, with Australia, and with a range of other countries. And in many cases, that may come with the expectation that London will kowtow to Washington's foreign policy. And we could well see this on the Iranian case, even though that puts British foreign policy at odds with its previous incarnation and with longer standing commitments to diplomacy and to a nuclear deal.
Dave Jonas, as they look at this in the war room, in the Pentagon or in the White House or the State Department, and the Iranians seize another tanker, right? When we look at the fact that 1/5 of the world's oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and we contextualize it with the sanctions and the crumbling deal and the proxy battles elsewhere in the region, do they freak out when there's news that another tanker has been seized, or do they see it as just a natural consequence of a tricky period?
That's a great question. I don't think there's any question about the Pentagon freaking out. I think that they've come to expect Iran to take hostile actions violative of international law, as we see from their active support for terrorism, their missile activity, and the fact that they're willing to breach the Iran nuclear deal, which they are still a party to. People talk about the U.S. breaking the deal, but the U.S. withdrew from the deal lawfully. Again, it wasn't a legally binding agreement, but they withdrew properly. Iran is still in the deal, and yet they're exceeding the enrichment limits allowed. I think from a military standpoint, what is the most interesting development that we have seen is this discussion of China now proposing to escort ships through the Gulf to join essentially a coalition of the U.S. and the U.K., and perhaps others will join, recognizing the importance of allowing the oil through that vital strait.
Yeah, well, I'm also reading the Israelis are in on it. Times of Israel reporting, Foreign Minister Israel Katz saying that Israel was involved in the U.S.-led naval mission to provide maritime security. You just add to the Israelis to this, and this can never be good, can it, Dave?
Well, when you talk about the Israelis, as I understand, the Israeli offer is not to provide actual military support in terms of military assets such as troops and ships, but rather intelligence support.
Right, but in a dispute with the Iranians, when you inject the Israelis into the mix, and I'm using Katz's own words, he says they were assisting the mission with intelligence and other unspecified fields, right? So you add the Israeli army or even the Mossad to this can't help.
Well, it should put Iran on notice that they're playing with fire.
That's interesting. Roger Tasmini, the Iranians, the conventional wisdom seems to be that the Iranians are threatening to choke the Strait of Hormuz and disrupt global oil supply, oil markets, the global economy, if pushed too far. Is that essentially what the Iranians are doing?
I think that's highly speculative and also an exaggeration of what's happening. All of these different discussions about drones or surveillance planes or mines or super tankers, I mean, all of these or this building up of different allies in the Strait of Hormuz, this is part of Trump's maximum pressure campaign after all. So it's not a surprise if he resorts to measures such as he did a few days ago, which was to sanction the Iranian foreign minister. It just shows that they are running out of strategies, approaches within the rubric of this maximum pressure campaign. So they are going to up the ante, and this seems to me to be a very taunting and provocative headline. But within the scope of the general strategy, it's not surprising. Now, whether it will yield any results remains to be seen, and it's from what we've seen, the pattern of how Iran has become more defiant, everything suggests that Iran will continue with this tit-for-tat, eye-for-an-eye approach in a very measured, calculated way. I mean, typical of Iran is that it does calculate its measures, and it hasn't done anything exaggerated, given the scenario at the moment.
Dave, do you believe that the Iranians are being measured?
Well, I do think that they try to, I agree with my colleague, that they try to keep their actions just under the wire in terms of what would result in a military response from the United States. I think in that regard that shooting down a U.S. unmanned drone was about as close as you can get, and indeed President Trump had dispatched a unit to conduct a military strike, but called it back at the last minute. Now, that may well have been calculated to send a message to Iran that you're getting very close to getting hit, but yet Iran continues to do what it's doing, right, and conduct risky actions.
Right. So, Simon, the UK is ready and willing to join this US-led international maritime security mission, as they call it, but is it willing to have this spiral out of control and go to war with the US against the Iranians?
Well, Boris Johnson certainly said in the past that he's not willing to go to war, that he will not let British troops go to war with Iran. He will not follow Washington into a conflict. But of course, he said a lot of things, and it remains to be seen whether he will stick to his word on this one or whether there'll be a change of policy. But I don't think that there's any real appetite in the United Kingdom to go to war with Iran. Of course, there are tensions, and of course, there are a number of serious political issues. But I certainly don't think that there is an appetite for conflict. And a conflict in the Gulf would be absolutely devastating for a whole host of reasons. It would be devastating for the global economy. It would be devastating for the people of the region. And they would be the ones paying the heaviest of prices. So I would certainly say that people in the UK are not wanting to go to war with Iran. And there would be a great deal of public pressure, much like we saw in 2003 with the protests against the Iraq war. There would be a similar expression of pressure and public outrage if it seemed like the UK would be going to war with Iran.
Okay, Simon Mabon, thanks ever so much for your thoughts. We're going to say goodbye to Simon Mabon now and bring in Iranian affairs analyst Saeed Mustafa Hoshcheshem from Tehran. Good to have you back on the show, Mr. Hoshcheshem. Is Iran the provoker or the provoked in this conflict?
Yeah, hello and thanks for having me. Well, it's no secret that Iran was in full compliance with the nuclear deal, and this has been, confirmed by over a dozen IAEA reports. Even people in Europe, across the world, even in the US, they have all been stressing that Iran has been in compliance with the deal. So it was the US that dropped the nuclear deal, reimposed the sanctions, and started escalating tensions. Also, it requested its ally, the UK, to seize the Iranian ship, and they are escalating the situation in order to force Tehran into the talks and to give more concessions. So Iran showed a year of tolerance, actually, until 3-4 months ago, in order to see if Europeans would comply with their undertakings. After that, when it came to the conclusion that nothing is going to happen with regard to receiving its promised merits under the nuclear deal, it shifted its policy to reciprocate the pressures that have been being placed on Iran with reciprocal moves. And Iran has not been doing anything beyond that. Like, if they have taken an Iranian ship, then Iran has not gone for 20 ships. It's not been on the offensive. Also, Iran has been reciprocating each and every move with a similar one to make the West, especially the United States, understand that they cannot do the hit and run anymore. If they place pressure on Tehran, they should pay the costs.
Okay, so Dave Jonas, we've had a timeline laid out for us from Tehran with a perspective that says cause and effect. And you take an Iranian tanker in Gibraltar, the Iranians will take a British-flagged tanker such as the Stena Impero. Cause and effect, tit for tat. Does that make sense to you, Dave?
Not exactly, because Iran plays on a number of fields and in a number of ways. They continue with terrorist actions. Some tankers were torpedoed in the Gulf, and while Iran has obviously not admitted to that, they are the most likely suspect. Again, they've shot down a U.S. drone over international airspace, which is violative of international law. So Iran, from my perspective, seems to be the provocateur.
Mustafa Hoshcheshem?
No, of course not. If you just pay attention to the words that my colleague used, he said he first accused Iran of being behind such attacks, but then he said Iran is a suspect. So we come to the conclusion, we all know that There has been no shred of evidence to substantiate such allegations against Iran. This could have well been a false flag operation by the Israelis, by the Americans and others in order to justify escalating tensions and their military buildup in the Persian Gulf. As we know, one of their main objectives since 2007, according to the Pentagon budget bill, has been stretching their military buildup in the Persian Gulf northwards towards the Strait of Hormuz in the hope that they could intimidate Tehran to retreat and to shrink its management control in the strait so that the U.S. could win a part or a role in managing the traffic of ships in the Strait of Hormuz. There has been no, evidence, anything at all, to prove that Iran is on the offensive. On the contrary, what Iran wants is very rationally and wisely, it says, okay, I've been in compliance, I've paid my dues, I have done everything, now it's my time to receive what I've been promised, the merits under the nuclear deal. If it ruins the nuclear deal, it would not receive anything and all the concessions it is given would be gone.
Right.
So what Iran wants is making the US and others understand that they need to pay their dues and they cannot intimidate Tehran anymore.
Okay, and we're going to get a response from Dave in a minute, but I wonder, Gonja, if we set aside the battlegrounds of Yemen, the battlegrounds of Syria, for example, let's put that away for the moment. Does Iran have many options besides seizing an oil tanker here and there in the Strait of Hormuz? Does it have a lot of options to retaliate in any way if it feels cornered by the West?
I think over the past 40 years, Iran has fostered deep alliance patterns throughout the region. It's provided all sorts of support for different militias that are fighting their own causes, which Iran supports. In this so-called arc of resistance, it's again premised on the revolutionary ideology, the discourse of fighting imperialism, fighting colonialism, and foreign encroachment. So this is very well entrenched in the region. One of the things that's interesting is that everybody talks about the potential aftermath of any sort of military confrontation with Iran. The question is, if Iran did not have these proxies or surrogates, as we call them, then the question is, would it not have been attacked by now? So it seems that this is part and parcel of Iran's security strategy because it has a sense of isolation, of strategic solitude.
Okay, that's a good point. So, Dave Jonas, I wonder, is the United States cautious? Are the Europeans cautious? Are others cautious precisely because the Iranians can retaliate in places that are not direct? So whether it's with Hezbollah or supporting Assad or supporting the Houthis and so on, and that's why this is such a very narrow and difficult needle to thread.
That's a great question, and I think the question answers itself in that Iran has used proxies and terrorist activities and the launching of missiles and other illegal activities to respond. In other words, no one expects a direct military response from Iran. It would be something along the lines of terrorist activity. And let me just say that regarding my Iranian colleagues' comments earlier, that it's a bit rich to hear that we should trust Iran. Remember that Iran, for 20 years, as a member of the legally binding Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and which had a legally binding safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, cheated for 20 years and was never in compliance by having secret nuclear facilities that were not declared in violation of the safeguards agreement.
Mustafa Hoshchesham?
Wrong, totally wrong. Because, first of all, if we take a look at the NIE report, that's the product of all the 16 intelligence bodies of the United States in two reports in 2007, 2010, at the time of Obama and George W. Bush, they stressed that Iran has not been cheating anyone and has not been moving towards a military nuclear capability. Also, when Mr. El-Baradei headed the IAEA, he stressed in several statements that all the ambiguities have been reported and clarified also on the eve of the nuclear deal, the IAEA stressed that the possible military dimension has been wrapped up, coming to the conclusion that Iran has not made any move towards a military nuclear capability. It's very unfortunate and sorry to hear these allegations after the world body, the nuclear watchdog, has been stressing that Iran has never made a move towards nuclear military capability. Also, what my colleague said about the safeguard agreements, it's a very interesting point, because when Iran was not a signatory of the new version of 3.1 safeguard agreement, it was requested to comply with the contents of this new 3.1 safeguards, while Iran was in full compliance with the old version, like many other states that had not endorsed the new version. But on the eve of the nuclear deal, Iran also endorsed this new version, and it has always been in full compliance, and there is not a big deal about, as far as the differences between the new version and the old version is concerned, there is nothing in there, and Iran has been always in compliance with it. If we had enough time, I would elaborate on the contents,
but I want to get a response from Dave.
that Iran has never, ever violated the contents.
Okay, Dave? Is Mustafa Hoshchesham cherry-picking his history, or does he have a point?
I believe he's cherry-picking, because even the International Atomic Energy Agency, which he cites often, has clearly stated that Iran never fully revealed the possible military dimensions of its nuclear program.
Okay, so, Khonja Tazmini, we look at the sanctions, we look at the crumbling Iran nuclear deal, we look at the situation of the tit-for-tat happening in the Strait of Hormuz, the proxy battles across the region. The simple question is, putting all of these things together, are we heading towards a military confrontation?
I think that if we were going to head towards military confrontation, there was already a perfect window, which was after Iran shot down the $200 million surveillance drone with an Iranian-made surface-to-air missile, allegedly in the vicinity of $20,000, $30,000. That was a perfect window for Trump to ratchet up militarily, and he didn't. There must have been a reason for that, a military reason, some sort of rationale. So I don't think that that's where we're headed. I think what we've seen is just the fortification of both the hardline narrative in Iran and the neocon stance in Washington. And really, this whole maritime circus has only yielded a deeper rift. And I don't see any sort of constructive engagement if we continue along this line.
Maritime circus, interesting way of putting it. Okay, Khonja Tazmini, Dave Jonas and Mustafa Hoshchesham, we're out of time.
Thank you.
But I do thank you all for joining us here on the News.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
When you put rival gangs in close proximity, you're asking for conflict. And that's exactly what happened in the Altamira prison in Brazil. 57 inmates were killed, 16 of which were beheaded after a brutal gang war broke out. The violence was so vicious that screams could be heard in a neighboring airport. But tragically, killings behind bars is common in Brazil. It has the third largest prison population in the world. Its institutions are underfunded and short-staffed. Political leaders say the solution is to build more facilities. But is that really the answer? Haider Abbasi takes a look.
Inmates have taken control of this prison in Brazil, but they're not trying to escape. Many of them are part of a gang. Police say members of one gang attacked their rivals, which provoked a riot. When the fighting ended, 57 people were dead.
The first news that we got was that he was in the first block and no one survived in that one, so we already knew that he was dead. There wasn't any hope left that he would be alive.
The killings happened in the northern city of Altamira. It was the worst prison riot in Brazil in almost 30 years. But prison violence there isn't rare. In May, 55 inmates were killed in 4 different facilities in the state of Amazonas. And in January 2017, 130 people were killed in riots across several jails. So why does this keep happening in Brazil's prisons? Rights groups cite 3 main reasons: overcrowding, gang rivalries, and underfunding. Brazil's prison population is the 3rd largest in the world, with more than 700,000 people behind bars. But they're only meant to hold half that number. Overcrowding makes it difficult to separate rival gangs. Human Rights Watch has called the prisons in Brazil inhumane. One researcher said he visited a cell that held 60 inmates with only 6 beds. Experts say there are no recreational activities for prisoners. Most facilities don't have a library or a gym, and many inmates don't have the chance to work. Staff in many prisons are poorly trained and underpaid, and they're often overpowered by inmates when riots break out.
Ask the victims of those who died there what they think. When they've replied, I'll answer you.
Brazil's new president has promised to be tough on violent crime and organized gangs. His government has been criticized for not investing more in education and strategies to prevent crime. And Jair Bolsonaro has also dismissed concerns about the conditions in Brazil's prisons. But it's the poor state of these prisons that seem to be fostering more violence. Brazil's largest drug gang, First Capital Command, was formed after a prison revolt over conditions. So without reforms to Brazil's system of justice and the way prisons are run, are more riots and killings inevitable? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, let's go to Boston, where we're joined by Bolsonaro supporter and CEO of the Public Administration Institute, Julio Moraes. And in Buenos Aires is Flavia Carbonari. She's an associate member of the Brazil Forum for Public Security. We reached out to the Brazilian government for comment, but we received no response. Let me start with you, Julio. We see this news that almost 60 inmates were killed, 16 decapitated. We read reports that they were playing football with the heads in the prison riot. And we think this is absolutely crazy. And then Brazilians tell us, you know what, this is crazy, but it's not new. It's normal in our prisons. Why?
Well, thanks for having me here once again. It's something that happened for the last couple of years. I think the message is clear. If you don't want to deal with the Brazilian prison, don't commit a crime. Unfortunately, that's the way Brazilian prisoners deal with each other. But I don't think it's nothing that the government can do, but I think it's better to deal with the good people outside, the victim families who lost their family or suffered some kind of crime because of those individuals, instead of taking care of them.
But
And
Julio,
let's be clear.
Julio, it sounds almost as if you're saying, well, if you committed a crime, you go to prison, you can expect to be decapitated in a gang war because that's just prison. That shouldn't be prison, should it?
Well, prison is not a vacation destiny. Let's put it this way. There's a lot of people homeless in Brazil that doesn't have a shelter, doesn't have a food. Why, if you commit a crime and go to prison, you're going to have food and shelter. So it should be the other way around. Brazilian law don't allow capital punishment. At least if they do something, if this gang war battle start to continue, at least those are criminals being suffering the consequence, not the good people outside.
Okay, so I want to add to what Julio's saying by quoting to you, Flavia, what Bolsonaro himself said. These guys, criminals, are going to die in the streets like cockroaches, and that's how it should be. We have to give a legal backup to the security people, civil, military, federal, road police. With that in mind, contextualize this for me as to the approach to criminal justice in in Brazil, and whether what we have seen with the riot especially is just a manifestation of that approach, Flavia?
Well, thanks for having me here, and I'm glad you brought up the comments made by the president, which I think Julio just made statements that are very similar to that. I think that type of rhetoric is very concerning because having overcrowded prisons and inmates in terrible human conditions, as we know is the case in Brazil, is only fitting to the problems that we are seeing now. We know that drug factions, they are pretty much in charge of several of the prisons that we have in Brazil right now. And under those conditions, you are just allowing them to fill in the gaps that the state is not providing, right? So there's a set of measures that are included in the penal law that are supposed to be provided within the penitentiary systems that is not provided, such as health, such as education, jobs. And I'm not even talking about the basic human standards. We have a really, really high rate of overcrowded prisons. In Brazil right now, you have 750,000 inmates, and that is 70% over the capacity that the country has to have those populations. So you can imagine the situation in which they are living, which just allows criminal organizations from within to organize themselves and take control even better. So it even makes it worse in response to what Julio was saying. It just makes it worse, and it won't help the situation to have them under those conditions.
So Julio, certainly. Yeah, let me get a response from Julio. So Julio, you have overcrowding, as Flavia has mentioned, right? There's often not enough money to go into prisons. And you have cartels and gangs that are waging war on each other outside of the prisons and inside of the prisons. With all of that in mind, isn't that an opportunity for the government to rethink everything rather than saying, oh, well, we don't care. Once we lock you up, you can kill each other. You deserve it.
It is. It's a big opportunity for the government, the current administration, to review the policies that we have in place right now regarding prison and the inmates. However, we have a big population outside the prison trying to get a job, try to get education, try to get the basic needs. I think those people need to worry about first instead of the people in the prison. Let's remember, commit a crime is an option. It's not just someone they pick up out of the street and put in prison. They commit a crime. Those people have affect life of many other people outside, people that are trying to work, try to live a normal life, and they can and choose to commit a crime. So I'll be honest with you. I think the government should take a look at and review the policies we have in place right now. But I think we have other priorities like education, health, shelter for those that are outside, trying to make the basic needs to give food on the table of the family.
Flavia Carbonari, address that for us. The Brazilian government should prioritize people who are outside of prisons, not those inside prisons.
I think one thing doesn't exclude the other. Brazil has extremely high rates of violence. We have homicides, 65,000 homicides per year. And if we don't address, of course, some of the things that Julio mentioned are also things that we need to address to prevent people to engage in crime activities, that's for sure. But the policies that we have right now in the justice system of mass incarceration, which has been going on it's not this administration in particular, it has been going on before that. So putting into jail minor offenders for small drug possessions, you have 40% of the inmates today waiting trial. You are just putting a lot of people in places that have become schools of crime. So these people, you are just putting more people in a place where they are going to be trained, where organized crime has been able to strengthen themselves. It should be mentioned that the massacres, the numbers that you gave in the beginning, these massacres that happened just now, there have been more than 10 over the past 10 years, more than 300 deaths. Right. And what happens now is that the two major drug factions in the country that were both from the southeast, from Rio and Sao Paulo, have spread over the country. They are fighting in other states through local gangs, so getting support from local gangs. And the major drug faction that we have today in Brazil, PCC, originated from within the prison. That's how they started. And today they're the biggest criminal organization in Brazil. So to keep just putting people in jail in those conditions where minor offenders get in touch with very high, dangerous criminals, it won't solve the problem. It won't solve the problem. And I think you need to address both things. Of course, we need to invest in education, in health, but you can't just wait till you see more of these situations happening. We had a very similar one happening 2 years ago, also in a northern state. So we need to do something. We need to address these issues as well. And more violence will not address the problem of endemic violence that we have in the country.
Flavia, I want you to have a little listen to Otávio Rego Barros, the presidential press secretary, in the aftermath of this massacre. Have a listen.
Minister Sergio Moro regrets the deaths and is determining how to step up intelligence actions. National forces stand ready.
What's interesting, Flavia, is that when we hear Barros speak, he says intelligence actions, national forces. This sounds, purely about military might or intel in order to fight. Is that just looking at it in a one-dimensional way?
I think so. I think if you keep the measures in those terms, it really is just looking to one dimension, and it won't solve the most structural problems, like I was saying before, the mass incarceration that we have been doing that have led to the incarceration in Brazil to more than double in a decade, and homicide rates have been increasing. So if you were to argue that that's solving anything, it's not.
Right.
The problem is increasing as well. And when he mentions intelligence, and of course the government has talked about it even before this administration, about increasing the jail security in jails and sending the most dangerous ones to federal prison systems that have more stronger measures, and that trying to prevent them to connect to other prisoners. But under the conditions that we have today, with the numbers that we have, and again, you are sort of allowing them to recruit more and more members from within the prison when you're sending the people to jail. So if you don't address first alternative sentence for minor crimes, if you don't address, for example, today I mentioned 40% of the inmates are waiting trial, and we have a clearance rate of homicides of 22% on average in the country. That means you do not have the guys that really, really should be in prison are not there. So there's a very, very famous in Brazil that is, we arrest a lot, but we arrest very poorly. So it's a matter of improving the quality of criminal investigation and having other alternatives for minor crimes, such as community services, house arrest, electronic monitoring. There are several things that could be offered for different types of crimes. And you should invest in criminal investigation to be able to arrest the ones that should really, really be inside prison.
Right.
But to continue like this, we're just going to be seeing more and more of these rebellions and massacres, also because of the infights that are growing among the two, the main criminal factions.
So Julio Moraes, according to the best available evidence that I have, government statistics, about 54% of the prison population in Brazil are males between the ages of 18 and 29, right? They don't have much education. Many of them come from poor families. So earlier in the discussion, you were saying, well, you made your choice, you committed a crime, you go to jail, you have to deal with the consequences. But honestly speaking, Julio, at 18, you're a kid in a poor neighborhood. Maybe your crime might have been a very small one. It might have been getting caught up in a gang, or it might have just been stealing a bicycle or something like that. I don't know, right? But you're a kid. Why have you closed the door to rehabilitating these young men? Why are you not open to the idea that somebody could go to prison and come out a changed person, rather than somebody going into a hellhole and a war zone and becoming fundamentally evil if you're witnessing all that stuff. If you survive all that stuff, if you survive all these massacres, you're probably going to end up becoming a real villain, right?
Yes, I agree with Flavio regarding the minor crime. You should be other options for them. Electronic monitoring, community service, many other options that could be in place of. However, I think the only investment that the government can do to avoid that, avoid overcrowded prisons, is through education. Instead of building prison, building schools, so we can prepare kids so they can understand the consequence of the actions. That's my point of view. Regarding the minor committing crime, like 18 years old, 20 years old, we've seen a lot of people younger than that commit like dangerous crime, like killing, kidnapping, rape. I see in my office, I practice law here in Massachusetts, and I see a lot of cases. People live in Brazil, hard work people live in Brazil because the Brazilian justice failed to protect them.
Mm-hmm. And just days after, Flavia, just days after the massacre, also a viral video that came out, and I guess this is somewhat, connected to it. And I'll end with this, Flavia. We had Clauvinho da Silva, the Brazilian drug trafficker, who dressed up as his daughter and tried to escape, and he was caught. And then just a couple days later, he was found dead, presumably hanged, allegedly hanged in his cell in Rio de Janeiro. What does that tell us about the Brazilian justice system? If you could find a way to connect that to what we were talking about earlier on.
I mean, it's the very unfortunate conclusions that it's not working. Whatever system we have in place is not working. And I just wanted to go back to one of the things that Julio just said about the people in prison. We need to remember that a lot of these people are going to come back to society one day. So whatever you are doing inside the prison, if we're not working on reinsertion, you are bringing these people much worse back to society, right? So it doesn't serve us either. I agree with him that we need to invest in education, but we also need to try to restructure the justice system in general. Like you said, I think the example you gave just shows that we are failing from beginning to end. So we need several measures from the prevention side, which is addressing, even with youth, as you said, an 18-year-old at this age, even from a brain development perspective, it is a period of time that you can make change, you can transform these people. So I think we need to work in both fronts.
Okay,
to
Flavia,
change the justice system.
Okay, it's been really good having this discussion with both of you. I appreciate you both taking the time. Flavia Carbonari and Julio Moraes, I thank you very much for joining us once again on The Newsmakers.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Actually, right here, right now, on our planet, leaders of some of the most powerful countries are talking space. Talking, no less, about weaponizing it. In July, French President Emmanuel Macron announced the establishment of a space command.
La nouvelle doctrine spatiale militaire qui m'a été proposée par la ministre et que j'ai approuvée permettra d'assurer notre défense de l'espace et par l'espace. Nous renforcerons notre connaissance de la situation spatiale. Nous protégerons mieux nos satellites, y compris de manière active.
That followed a similar announcement by the US President last year.
I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces. That's a big statement.
And some military leaders agree that space is now a battlefront.
Space is one of our vital national interests in the sense of our use of space, our operations in space, and it is becoming a contested warfighting domain, and we have got to adapt to that reality.
The Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency released a report in February saying China and Russia are developing space weapons such as anti-satellite missiles. Other countries, including India, North Korea, and Iran, have military space programs. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, signed by 132 countries, forbids the deployment of weapons of mass destruction in space, as well as weapons of any kind on the Moon and other celestial bodies. But conventional weapons are not banned, and the UN has raised the alarm at the prospect of future space wars, which could affect us all. Egypt's representative to the UN Disarmament and International Security Committee has expressed the concerns of the Arab, African, and non-aligned groups.
Taking into consideration the extreme fragility and volatility of the outer space environment, it must not be allowed to turn into another battlefield or a scene for military conflicts that could have catastrophic implications.
Satellites are critical to such a wide range of applications, from communications to international development, that they are a benefit to all humans. And the US operates the most satellites by far. Yet for some, the sky is never the limit.
When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important.
But if space is to remain for the benefit of all, as the UN intends, is it now time to ban the use of all weapons there? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, it's been 5 years since police killed Michael Brown, sparking riots in Ferguson, Missouri. We debate the progress of Black Lives Matter and ask whether Donald Trump in the White House means the movement has failed. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.